My muscle memory is off. Thank you. All right, Chevron Zoom, you still me all right? Excellent. Good, perfect. All right, we'll say good morning. Let us begin. So first I want to thank Rabbi Richter for giving shir over the last 2 days while I was out. Thank you so much. Jose, okay, so let's begin. A lot to do today. We'll Emir Hashem. Good. Jose, we're starting on today's daf is Ayin Gimel 73, and we are starting 3 lines down from the top. Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph. Some really great cases. Cheresh Mahu Sheyafir Leishto. Rabbi say, what is the halacha? What is the halacha ultimately again of a cheresh? Is a cheresh able to go ahead and annul the vows of his wife? Now, both say, if you take a quick look at the Ran, so the Ran says over here, it's in the intermediate wide lines, about 1, 2, 3, 4 lines in. So both say, so the first thing the Ran says is, what type of cheresh are we talking about over here? So here's what's interesting. In general, when we find cheresh in Gemara, what does cheresh mean? Deaf mute. Shabbos, I said, obviously can't be what the Gemara is referring to over here, because a deaf mute lacks das. So without das, obviously you can't annul any Nedarim. Therefore, the Ran says the cheresh we're dealing with over here is cheresh hamedaber ve'eno shamea. This is a cheresh who is able to hear, able to speak, but unable to hear. So the shaila is, and Nabosai, remember, speech in and of itself is the greatest expression of das. If a person is able to dialogue, that indicates that they have mental capacity. So therefore, a husband has mental capacity. What's the problem over here? Technical issue. He's unable to hear his wife's nedarim. So now, what's the shaila? So again, back to the Gemara. So does a cheresh have the ability to annul his wife's vows? So let's analyze this. Imtim salomar bal mefer below shmiya. So we'll say, now remember, if we go back to the previous sugya, so remember the Gemara asked the shaila, does the husband have the ability to go ahead and annul his wife's vows without hearing them? And I will say, so the truth is, let me just tell you the halacha l'maisa from that sugya before we go weiter. So the Rambam in Hilchos Nedarim, Perek Yud Aleph, halacha chaf Aleph. Perek Yud Aleph, halacha. I just want to tell you, it's incredible to think about the days that we live in. A while ago, Maishi introduced me to the Safaria app, right? So I will say, so I was out of town last 2 days, so I was preparing the daf somewhere else. I didn't have Sfarim with me. So I will say, it's absolutely incredible, just to show like the days that we live in. So I wanted to look up the Rambam. So I pull up Sfaria, you have it on there, but it gets better. So I took a screenshot of Sfaria, which my 12-year-old taught me how to do. Right? So I took a screenshot. Right? I sent it to my assistant in the office, and she printed it for me. So I come back this morning. It's an incredible thing. I have all my Rambams printed out for me, right from all of my screen. I'll say it's an incredible thing, but it's an awesome mechayiv, because what's going to happen. After 120, we're going to come up to Shamayim, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to say, no, why didn't you become an outstanding Talmid Chacham? And I'm going to say, what do you mean? I had a job. What do you mean? I'm a guy. What do you mean? I was standing Talmid Chacham. I learned, I did. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to say, 1 second, you lived in a time where you had all of these tools for learning. Anything and everything you want is literally, again, at your fingertips. Anything and everything you want is right there. So we sometimes look at these tools for learning as like a convenience, which it is, but it's more than just a convenience. It's a mechayiv. It obligates us to really up our game, and it obligates us to really push ourselves to take on more and to learn more, because we're living in a time where literally it's just so easy. Any event. So the Rambam writes in Hilchos Nedarim Perek Yud Aleph Halacha Chaf Aleph. Listen to this. V'chein abal. So the Rose said this is actually the conclusion of the previous sugya. V'chein abal shelo tikanis l'rshuso omer la kol nedarim shenadart misheirastich ad shelo tikansi v'soch beisi Harihein mufarin shabal mefer nidre ishta afa pi shalo shama osam. So we'll say, so the Rambam paskins that a husband has the ability to go ahead and annul his wife's vows, even if he did not hear them. Now remember, this is talking about a very specific case of during Erusin. During Erusin, a husband wants to annul all of his wife's vows that she took between Erusin and Nisun. In other words, when they get married, he doesn't want her coming into marriage with any vows on her. So he can go ahead and annul any of her Nedarim that she took during the period of Erusin, even if he did not hear them. So we'll say, so that's halacha number one. Now, again, so that is important because Gemara is going to be operating on this, based on this assumption. A husband has the ability to annul his wife's vows during Erusin, even if he did not hear them. So back to the Gemara. So here we go. So imtim solomar bal mefer below shmiya. So we'll say, like we said before, a husband has the ability to annul his wife's vows during Erusin, even if he did not hear them. But we'll say, but why is that? Mishum debar mishmahu. I will say, but that's because he's able to hear them. In other words, the Gemara is suggesting, maybe the reason a husband has the ability to annul his wife's vows, even if he didn't hear them, was why? Because he has the ability to hear them. He has the ability to hear them. So the Gemara says, so we'll say, what does that mean? He has the ability to them. Listen to this. Hanud Rabbi Zera, Dam Rabbi Zera, Kalaroi lebila, ein bila ma'akevesbo. So I will say, this is actually a fascinating halacha. Because what does Rabbi Zera say? Anything that can be mixed, so mixing is not ma'akev. Now I will say, what is this referring to? It's referring to a karban mincha. So remember again, a karban mincha is fine flour together with oil. You put that all in a big bowl. So the Gemara says like this, we'll say, so the halacha normally is that the karban mincha itself has to be mixed. Now, after you mix it, a mincha is prepared in different ways. But the Gemara says like this, is mixing ma'akev. Let's say you have a karban mincha, you didn't mix it up. Is that ma'akev? Does that somehow, is that a crucial part in the kashrus of the karban? So the Gemara gives a very interesting klal. Rabbi Zera says, anything that can be mixed, mixing is not ma'akev. But if something cannot be mixed, then mixing is ma'akev. Now both say, what does it mean can be mixed, can't be mixed? The Gemara understands this mean like this. It will say, if you go ahead and you fill the mincha bowl to the point that it's set, I will say, you ever try to mix something? If you fill the bowl too high, what happens when you mix it? Everything pours over the side. So if the mincha bowl is filled up too high, that if you were to mix it, ultimately, again, it would pour over the side, then that mincha is invalid. That mincha is invalid. Why? Because it's not mixable. However, if the mincha is mixable, but you failed to mix it, halacha l'maaseh, karban mincha is still going to be kosher. Shabbos say, this creates an interesting paradigm. What's the paradigm? The paradigm says like this, anything or any situation where a process can occur, even if it doesn't occur, the failure to perform the process does not undermine the effectiveness of the particular thing. That's not good English. Right? In other words, let me say it differently. Any situation where a process could occur, but the process did not occur, the process is still kosher, as long as the process could have technically occurred. But any situation where halacha l'maaseh the process could not have occurred, failure to perform the process ultimately undermines its kashrus. So again, Rabbi Zera says that the paradigm of that is karban mincha. Any mincha which is mixable, even if you don't mix it, the mincha is kosher. But if the mincha was not mixable, then halacha l'maaseh failure to mix it renders it invalid. That becomes a paradigm. So you could apply that over here also. What do we say? See, we just said before that if the husband doesn't hear his wife's nedarim, he could still go ahead and annul them. Why? Because he has the ability to hear them. So maybe as long as husband has the ability to hear the nedarim, ultimately, again, that is going to be enough. Even if he doesn't hear it, it's still going to be, he can still annul it. But if he can't hear it, i.e. he's deaf, maybe halacha l'maaseh, that undermines his ability to go ahead and annul the nedarim. Dilma, so that's one possibility. So the Gemara will say, so remember, let's just keep the stage of the process over here. What's our question? Can a cheirish husband, can a deaf husband annul his wife's vows? So we'll say, so far again, so if we accept the premise that a husband has the ability to annul his wife's vows, even if he doesn't hear them, Maybe that's because the husband possesses the ability to hear them. And as long as you have the ability to hear, even if you don't hear, that's not going to undermine the process. However, a cheresh doesn't have the ability to hear, and therefore his inability to hear perhaps fundamentally undermines his ability to annul his wife's vows. Oh, Dilma, or I will say perhaps the pasuk of Dilma, V'shama isha loma akev. Or I will say, now remember again, the whole chap of hearing this, I will say, is because the pasuk itself says, V'shama isha, her husband will hear. Maybe that's just an expression. And lemaisa, again, it's not meant ultimately, again, to be specific. So we'll say, so what's the halacha? Amarava, tashma, v'shama isha. Rava says, the pasuk says, v'shama isha. What do we learn from there? Prat le'ishes cheresh shmamina. They will say that comes to ultimately, again, exclude the wife of a cheresh, and indeed, learn from here that halacha lemaisa cheresh doesn't have the ability to annul his wife's vows. So I will say, so again, this is the halacha. The Rambam in Perek Yud Beis, halacha Yud Gimel. Halacha Yud Gimel says as follows. So we'll say Perek Yud Beis, halacha Yud Gimel. Here we go. The Gemara says, one second. Yeah, here it is. Ha'av ha'abal she'ein shomim ein meferin. So let's listen to this. A father or a husband who do not go ahead, who cannot hear, don't have the ability to annul the vow. So I will say, so now listen to this. Afapi shabam mefer nedarim shloshim. So we'll say, listen to the Rambam here. The Rambam says, halacha l'maisa. If the father or the husband don't she'ein shomin. Now she'ein shomin means they're deaf. If they're deaf, they don't have the ability to annul the vow. So we'll say, so one second. Afapi shabam mefer nedarim shloshim. But what did we just say? We just said from the previous halacha, that's what? That even if a husband doesn't hear the vows of his wife during Erusin, he has the ability to annul them. So how do you reconcile those two halachas? Right? Rambam here just said, if the father or the husband don't have the ability to hear, they can't annul the vow. But yet, even though we said before that a husband can annul vows that he did not hear, how do you reconcile that? Very simple. Haroi lishmoa ein hashmua ma'akebes bo. They will say that Rambam essentially accepts the halachic principle of Rabbi Zera, that as long as the husband has the ability to hear, in other words, we'll say, essentially what's happening over here is as follows. When the Torah says, V'shama isha, her husband hears, what is the Torah telling us? That in order for hataras nedarim or hafaras nedarim to occur, what has to happen? The husband has to have the ability to hear. That is the gzeras hakasa. I will say that's the pasuk. Husband has to have the ability to hear. And if husband doesn't possess the ability to hear, then halacha l'maaseh he does not have the ability to annul his wife's nedarim. That's the halacha. Now we'll say there's a follow-up halacha. What's the follow-up halacha? That during Erusin, a husband has the ability to say to his wife, any nedarim you took during Erusin, I am annulling, even if he did not hear them. But he didn't hear them. So we'll say, this is where we're getting to Rabbi Zera. What does Rabbi Zera say? See, as long as he had the ability to hear, that counts it almost as if that he heard it. Because Ka'aroi lebila ein bila ma'akebes. Again, the paradigm from Kal Mincha, as long as it could be mixed, then halacha l'maaseh failure to mix does not negate the effectiveness of the carbon. So we'll say, so two important pieces of halacha l'maaseh. So number one, a husband does have the ability to go ahead and annul his wife's vows during Erusin, even if he did not hear them. Halacha number two, a husband must hear his wife's vows in order to annul them. I know it sounds a little bit contradictory, but you understand the reconciliation. And halacha number three, a cheresh, therefore, a husband who is deaf does not have the ability to go ahead and annul his wife's vows. Incredible. Ibarilu. They both say, Ayin Gimel and Aleph 73a. We're now picking up 2, 4, 6 lines up from the bottom. Ibarilu. Bal Maushiyah for the Shtei Nashim Basachos. We'll say, interesting case here. Does a husband have the ability to annul he has two wives, right? Let's say again, Reuven is married to Rachel and Leah. Rachel and Leah both made vows. Could Reuven annul their vows simultaneously? They both say, take a look at the Ran for just a moment. This is the Ran in the wide lines, 2, 4, 6 lines in. Ibailu ba mashia for the shtei nashav asachos, shinadru shtehen, yomar lahen mufar lachon. So we'll say they both made nedarim. They both made Nedarim. Now, I will say it's possible that maybe they made the same Nedarim or didn't make the same. It doesn't really matter, right? They both made a Neder at the same time. Does he have the ability, or even not at the same time? They both made a Neder on the same day. Does he have the ability to go ahead and annul their Nedarim simultaneously? Okay, so we'll say let's analyze. So the Gemara says, do we say Osa Dafka or Lav Dafka? So we'll say the lashon of the pasuk is he annuls the neder for her, Osa, singular. So what's the shaila? Do we say that Osa singular is specific? Namely, that the Torah is telling us that a husband only has the ability to annul the nedarim for his wife one at a time, or not? Or maybe no, just Osa is an expression. In other words, it's not dafka, it's not specific. And in a husband could go ahead and annul the nedarim of two wives at the same time. So let's analyze. Amar Ravina. Ravina says as follows, Tashma. Let's analyze. So we'll say if you take, first I'll just take a quick look at the Ran, right in the same place. It's 2, 4, 6, 7 lines in the wide lines. Osa dafka, biyom shemoa isha, yania osa. We'll say that's the phrase of the pasuk. On the day that her husband hears her, yania osa, he'll restrain her. V'hod debaye bebal, huadin ba'av, degabe avna miksevasa. Ran just points out, we'll say, by the way, that the same question by the father by the husband, the same question by the father. Let's say a father has two daughters, right? And both daughters make nedarim. Does the father have the ability to annul the nedarim of his two daughters simultaneously? Okay, so we'll say, so what's the shaila? Shaila in the pasuk. When it says Yaniya Osa, he restrains her, he annuls her nedar, Osa singular, is it meant singular dafka, only one annulment at a time? Or no, you could even do group annulments. So the Gemara says as follows. Let's analyze. Amar Ravina says, Tashma, in mashkin shtei sotos ke'achos mipnei shaliba gas bechaverta. So we'll say it's an interesting case. So we'll say we know what's a sota. A sota ultimately is a woman who is suspected of adultery. And not just suspected, it's very important, right? Reuven's married to Rachel, and Reuven perceives that Rachel is behaving inappropriately with another man. So we'll call him Shimon. So what happens? Reuven says to Rachel, you are not allowed to be alone with Shimon. Okay? He gives her this warning in front of witnesses. She then violates the warning and is alone with Shimon for enough time, we call the Gemara says, for enough time for something illicit to have occurred. Now both say, do we know did something occur? Did something occur? We don't know. But there's certainly enough circumstantial evidence for us to be concerned. Both say that triggers the process of sota, by which she has to go up to the Beis HaMikdash. Remember again, they write the parasha of sota on a piece of parchment. The parchment is dissolved in water. She drinks the water, and it's that water that checks whether or not she chas v'shalom committed adultery. So the Gemara says as follows: In mashkin shei sotos ka'achos. I will say we do not go ahead. Let's say again, you have two women who show up for the sota process simultaneously. Two women, not co-wives, just two women, two independent women. They just both happen to show up to the Beis HaMikdash for the sota process simultaneously. The Gemara says we do not administer the waters to them simultaneously. There's no group sota. No group sota waters, right? In other words, we only do them one at a time. We'll say, now, why is that? Very interesting. Mipnei shalibo gas bechaverta. Now, we'll say, what does that mean? Look at the Ran again. Mipnei shalibo gas bechaverta. This is incredible. Shepamim shechaverta tahora v'hitmea. We'll say, what are we concerned about? Imagine for a moment there are two women who show up for the sota process. Woman A and woman B. It's not right to use Rachel and Leah, right, for this, right? So woman A and woman B, they show up ultimately for the sota process. So we'll say, so what happens? A shows up, and A did not do anything. So she knows that she's tahora. So we'll say, so remember again, if she's tahora, what is she willing to do? Drink the water. Because let's remember again, the Gemara Masechah Sota brings down, we're going to get to this soon, Gemara Masechah Sota brings down that if a woman is not guilty of adultery, the waters actually act as an incredible source of bracha for her. So she's willing to drink. Now remember, we'll say, part of the whole sota process is, we tried to convince the woman, admit your guilt. Don't go through this process. Don't have the name of Hashem erased in the water, right? If you're guilty, admit your guilt. So woman A, she's not guilty. And if she's not guilty, there's nothing to admit. So she stands her ground, and what are we concerned about? The Ran says, on the other hand, v'hi temeya. So I'll say, now listen to this. So what's the concern? The concern is A is innocent. B is guilty. B is going to be watching A. right? And A is going to say, I'm innocent, I'm good to go, right? Bring it on, right? Erase those waters, right? Step parchment, right? I'm ready to drink it. So what's going to happen? B is going to be emboldened, right, to lie because A is proclaiming her innocence. Meanwhile, it's in best interest of B not to drink those waters, because if she did commit adultery, those waters will kill her, right? So instead, so much better off for B just to admit her mistake. Again, there are precautions for that, but at least her life is spared. So because of that, we do not go ahead and administer waters to two women simultaneously out of concern that one will be innocent and the second one who is guilty will feel emboldened to proclaim her innocence even though she's not really innocent. Where perhaps if she's just doing it privately, one-on-one with the Kohen, maybe she'll feel a little bit more confident just to go ahead and admit her transgression. So Imashkin saw those Rabbi Yehuda says, no, that's not the reason. Vihishka osa levada. So we'll say no, because by sota, what does it say? Vihishka osa. We'll say, what's osa? Osa means her what? Her alone. Her alone. So everyone will say, what does it mean, her alone? That Allah Lamaisa, again, what it means is we only do one sota at a time. It's Xeris HaKasum. So we'll say, what do you see from here? That whenever you have the word osa, what does osa mean? Osa means one person at a time. One person at a time. So we'll say, let's plug this back to what we said. What was our shaila? Our shaila was, could a husband go ahead and annul Nedarim for two of his wives simultaneously? So we'll say, it sounds like based on what the Gemara is saying over here, that what should be the answer to that? No, why not? Because our sugya, our pasukos is vihina osa. He restrains her, he annuls her neder osa. Sounds like, again, halacha lamaisa, one at a time. So we'll say, Rambam Paskins over here. This is again in Parak Yud Gimel. Halacha Yud Dalit. I will say, here it is. The Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, V'habal. So how does the Rambam Paskin? V'habal meifer nidre shtei noshav ka'achas. So we'll say the Rambam Paskin is actually different than what it sounds like is the conclusion of the Gemara. We're actually already, the Ran already Paskins like the, actually the Rambam already Paskins like the Ran. Namely, a husband does have the ability to annul the Nedarim for two wives simultaneously. In other words, we both say that we do not accept this drasha of Osa. Osa does not mean specifically one at a time, but Allah Chalamaysa, we paskin that a husband does have the ability to annul Nedarim for two wives simultaneously. Beautiful. I will say, let's go back to Amud Beis and Gimel Beis Mishnah. Mishnah, really interesting case. Bogeretz Shisha Seyud Beis Chodesh. So we'll say this is a throwback to our Ksuvas days, which is always very, very exciting. So we'll say, so now listen to this. A Bogeres, or right, a Bogeres who waited 12 months, or an Amana 30 days. And we'll say, now let's analyze this for just a little bit. So just the context. We'll also remember again, this is actually the first Mishnah of Maseches Ksuvas. We'll say, remember again, what's Talacha? There was often up to a year in between Erusin and Nisuin. During that year, what obligations does a husband have in support of his wife? 0. Now the halacha is once that year elapses, if the husband does not marry his wife, then what doesn't do nisuin, then what? Right? Again, the support clause, the support obligation is triggered. Remember again, we had this again. You remember this in Suvas, nistapcha sadeu. What happens if halacha say they don't get married, but it's not his fault? It's because of her circumstances, is the support obligation triggered? So that's what's happening over here. So Bogeres Shisha Seyud Beis Chodesh. So we'll say if you have a Bogeres who waited 12 months, so there was Erusin, and now 12 months have elapsed, and it's time to marry her, or Va'amana Lamed Yom, or for that matter, again, an Amana, a widow, after 30 days. So we'll say, again, we'll discuss in just a moment. Rabbi Eliezer, so we'll say, okay, let me say this right now. So Allah Kamaisa, the idea is that normally a girl gets 12 months to prepare for Nisuin from the time of Erusin. Why is that? Because again, there's an assumption that there's time needed for her to get her accessories, to get her jewelry, to get whatever she needs to get married. An almana is someone who is already married and therefore already had this stuff gathered. So because of that, she doesn't need a year. What does she need? She needs 30 days. Well, so we're going to see a Bogeres also doesn't need a year, right? Really, the year is really for a Nara. But okay, we'll explain in the Gemara just a moment. So in any event, a Bogeres after 12 months, or All right, and I'm on after 30 days. So we'll say, so these women, so if a man, Reuven did Erisin with Rachel, right? Now 12 months have elapsed. Or if Rachel's an Amana, 30 days have elapsed. And we'll say, what happens after 12 months for a Bogeres? After 30 days for an Amana, what's triggered? Support clause, right? Support clause is not obligated. Rabbi Lezer Omer, Hoilu by Lechem Zonosea Yofer. So Rabbi Lezer says, well, now that the husband is obligated to support her, he also has the power to revoke her Nedarim. Fascinating. In Rabbi Eliezer's model, if you have to support her, you have the power of Nedar revocation as well. You both say, take a look at the Ran. Ran is the right-hand side, second line down from the top. Hoil ubay l'chaim zonoseh, kidisnan parak afapi dinosin l'psula yubeis chodesh. Ula'achar mikan chaim zonoseh, kidisnan higiyaz man v'lo nasu. Ocheles mishal yafer, v'vado below shutfosel da'av. We'll say, here's the chiddush. Remember again, we established before, during Erisin, how do you revoke, how does the Arusa have her Nedarim revoked? Who could revoke her Nedarim? Father and husband, b'shutfos. But there's this chiddush is, if a year goes by, even though there's still an Erisin, once the support clause is triggered, husband has the power of revocation all by himself. Sole power of revocation. The Chum say no. Ein habal mefer achet tikanes l'shuso. Chum disagree. They say no, not true. Husband only has full or sole power of revocation when? Ultimately, again, during in nisuin. So I will say it's really fascinating. So just understand what's happening over here. Rabbi Eliezer is saying that once the husband has the obligation of support, he gains the power of sole revocation. The Chum say not true. The power of sole revocation only comes when? During Nisuin. But any time before Nisuin, husband does not have that koach. So Amar Rabba says, let's analyze. Amar Rabba Lazar u'Mishnah Rishona amru davar echad. So this is very interesting. Rabbi says, Rabbi Eliezer, and the Mishnah Rishona and the original iteration of this halacha say the same thing. I will say, take a look at the Ran for just a moment. Very exciting. The Ran is right across. You don't have to try to find it now. Right? Literally, just move your finger to the right-hand column and it's right there. Rabbi Eliezer, Mishnah Rishona, Amru Davar Echad, Dechishegia Zmana Linase, Velo Nises, say that once the time to get married comes, i.e. after the year, and husband does not marry her, Kevan Shechayiv Baila Bimzonosel, Chashvina Lein Linesua, Liktsas Dvarim, the Afa Pish in a base Baila. So we'll say, this is very interesting. Essentially, what Rabbi Eliezer is saying is like this. Once the year goes by, right? They did Erisin, a year went by, he's not obligated to do Nisuin. If he doesn't do it, essentially, the woman becomes a Nesua for certain things. In Rabbi Eliezer's model, what does she become a Nesua for? Number one, support. He's obligated to support her. Everybody agrees with that, right? But he's obligated to support her. Number two, how does she become a Nesua? Hafaras Nedarim. He now has sole power to revoke her, to annul her Nedarim. Okay, so here we go. This I will say, see, here is the original iteration of this halacha. This nan, Nostin lebesula yud beis chodesh, lefarnis atzma. We give a basula 12 months in order to get herself ready for her wedding. Okay, Higia yud beis chodesh. Once 12 months elapse, you saw ocheles. So Higia beis chodesh ocheles mishalo v'ocheles b'truma. The Rebbe say, now what happens after 12 months? If 12 months elapse and he does not marry, let's assume the reason why they're not getting married is on his side, right? 12 months elapse and he did not do nisuin, then what's the halacha? She eats his food, i.e. he supports her. It wasn't his bigger chiddush. V'ocheles b'truma. If he's a Kohen, ultimately again, she goes ahead and eats truma as well. And then I both say, we're going to see this in just a moment, but let's analyze this in just a moment. Why doesn't an arusa eat truma? Rabbi say, remember again, midda oraisa. What do you need in order to eat truma? Right? What do you need to eat truma? I guess to be a Kohen, or miknas kaspo, someone acquired by a Kohen. Now I will say, based on that, an arusa should be able to eat truma, right? Because ultimately, again, he's given her kesef kiddushin. She's quote unquote acquired through money. So ultimately, why does she not eat truma? I will say two reasons. Remember, we learned this again. Two reasons. Reason number one is ultimately, again, mishum simphon. There's a concern that maybe he's going to find some type of blemish that's going to trigger a mekach taos, avoiding of the whole relationship, and therefore, again, what's going to happen? It's going to turn out retroactively that she was not married to a Kohen and yet consuming truma. So, in order to avoid that, what we essentially do is no truma until after nisuin. Second passage says, what are we concerned about? That, remember, where is she living during Erusin? Where is she living? Father's home. We're concerned that if we allow her to eat truma, she's going to take some truma that she's getting from her chassan and what? Bring it home to her family. Those are the two concerns. I just want to. So this is interesting. So midoraisa, and arusa is permitted to eat truma. Midrabanan, we say she cannot. So now watch this. Therefore, during Erusin, she can eat truma. After 12 months go by, if he does not do nisuin with her, then halacha lemaisa, he's obligated to support her, and she can eat truma. Aval yavam eno machel b'truma. But Rabbi said, listen to this. If it's a yibum case, then halacha lemaisa, she cannot go ahead and eat truma even after 12 months. Even after 12 months. Rabbi say we're going to see the reason for that is because remember yibum. She is not considered to be the Yavam's kinyan, right? She is considered to be the deceased brother's kinyan. So because of that, Yibum does not, or we're waiting for Yibum, even after a year, does not entitle to eat truma. We'll see it in just a moment. So let's listen to this. Rabbi say, if let's say again she was 6 months erusin in front of her chassan, then the chassan died, and ultimately again she's 6 months in front of the yavam. Afilu kulan b'fnei abal, even again the majority of the year in front, or all of the year with her husband. Chasi yom echad, right? O kulan b'fnei yavam chassan yom echad. Rabbi say, now again the yavam piece is not really our focus over here, but what the yavam piece is here's the halacha, right? The original iteration of the halacha. A man does erusin with a woman, she has 12 months to prepare for the wedding. If after 12 months come and he does not do nisuin, Rabbi say what happens? It triggers a support clause, right? And along with that support clause, interestingly enough, what else does a woman get? If her husband is a Kohen, truma. Then the Gemara just goes into depth saying none of this applies to a yavam, right? With a yavam, even after a year, let's say he didn't do yibum for a year, she's a shemer, she's waiting for yibum. There's no support clause, and ultimately, again, there's no truma. Or actually, at least there's no truma. But we're going to leave aside the yavam. But we'll say that's the first iteration of the halacha. Beizin shalachreim amrun. Now we'll say a subsequent Beizin came along and said as follows: Ein ha'isho chalis b'truma achet tikanes l'chuppah. Wow. So we'll say, so the second version of this halacha, or the second Beizin came along and reframed the halacha and said no. We'll agree that the support clause is triggered up to a year. So in other words, after a year. Well, so they're not arguing on the core halacha, namely that if a man does erusin, he has a year in which to do nisuin, and if after the year he doesn't do nisuin, that triggers the support clause. However, not truma. Truma is not to be consumed by a woman who marries a Kohen until after she enters into the chuppah. And I will say now, why is that? Take a look at the first Y line. Well, it's actually the last two intermediate lines. Bezdin Shachrim Amru Ein Isha Chaz B'Shum Ashtikran Schol. Say first Y line. Omefarshi Hasam Tamayu Imishum Simphon Kilomar Shema Yimatze Bamum Benimtza Mekcho Mekachtos Imishum Shema Tashke Kosho Truma Lachelachos. Exactly what we said before. I will say because of the two concerns. So the second Bezdin had two concerns. Number one, maybe Simphon. Simphon was saying he'll find a mum. Right? It's only after they're married, they're going to be intimate together. Maybe he's going to find some type of mum that disqualifies, that makes the whole thing a mekach tos. That's concern number one. Concern number two is we're concerned she's going to take some of the truma back to her family and give them truma. Either way, Rabbi say the second Bezdin said no truma until after chuppah. No truma until after nisuin. So Rabbi say, now watch this. Now the idea over here is, now I'll say, so remember, so Amalei Abai, so we'll say, so what are we trying to figure out over here? The Gemara is trying to say that Rabbi Eliezer himself fits in with the Mishnah Rishona. Right? Rabbi Eliezer said that halacha l'maisa, since ultimately, again, after a year, a husband is chayiv in mizonos, therefore he also attains full or sole revocation abilities. So the Gemara says, and I want to suggest that the Mishnah Rishon of the first Mishnah ultimately is in complete alignment with Rabbi Eliezer. Amrli Abai says maybe not. Damalohi ad kan lo ka'ashma ina Mishnah Rishona ela lamecha b'truma d'Rabbanan. Shabbosai. So now remember, I want to point out over here, the Gemara wants to point this out as well, which is the Gemara here makes no mention of Hataras Nedarim or Hafaras Nedarim, right? In other words, that's not mentioned over here. All the Mishnah Rishona or the Mishnah Shnia are talking about is what? Support. And the Mishnah Rishona, Mishnah Shnia arguing, the Mishnah Rishona, after a year she gets support and she can eat Truma. Second version of Halacha, second basin says she can't eat Truma. So Abaye says, 1 second, there's no mentioning of Nedarim. So Dilma, Lohi, Ad kan lo kashma inan Mishnah Rishona el lamecha b'Truma d'Rabbanan. So I'll say ultimately again, all the Mishnah Rishona is lying, Rabbi says, for what? Truma consumption. Now remember, in the first Mishnah, Rabbi say, the idea that after a year we allow an arusa to eat Truma, Rabbi say, let's be honest, is that a very big deal that after a year we allow her to eat Truma? Is that a big deal? No. Why not? Because remember, says we said before Midoraisa, she's allowed to eat Truma. Right? It's only Midrabanan that she's not allowed to eat Truma. So essentially, what do we do after a year? Okay, if husband hasn't married her, after you know what we do? We lift the Drabanan and we allow her to eat Truma. It's not such a big deal. I will say, Aval Nedarim Daraisa Imalo. 1 second. But to give the husband sole revocation power still during Erisin, who says that the Beis didn't allow that? That's furthermore, the Gemara says, Va'adkan, Lo Shamasei Rabbi Eliezer Elagabi Nedarim, Kidrav Pinchas Mishmei Derava. So furthermore, I will say, one could also say, we only learn the Salach Rabbi Eliezer when it comes to Nedarim. I will say, because what the Gemara just simply wants to suggest is that the Mishnah Rishona and Rabbi Eliezer don't necessarily align. Because all the Mishnah Rishona is allowing is after a year, a woman is allowed to eat Truma. That's not such a big shkoyach, because Midaraisa, she could have consumed Truma anyway. So all we're allowing after a year is essentially we're lifting an Isser D'Rabbanan. But that doesn't say anything about vesting the husband with sole revocatory power. Furthermore, again, even Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah is only talking about Nedarim. He says after a year, husband gets sole revocatory power. In general, we could say that whenever a woman makes a neder, ultimately again, she makes a neder with the das of her husband. Take a look at the Ran for just a moment, Rabbi. It's like smack in the middle of the widest lines. There's very interesting. See, we thought the reason, and the Ran himself said this probably, we thought the reason why after a year, Rabbi Eliezer vests the husband with sole revocatory power is because essentially after a year she becomes a little bit like an Isua. Maybe that's not it. Maybe the reason at the end of the day that after a year he has sole revocatory power is because a woman, when she makes a neder, understands that she wants her husband to consent to that neder, even if it's just during Erisin. Al das baila, I will say, because again, a neder b'pasha is going to impact their relationship. She makes a neder with the consent or understanding of her husband. That's why Rabbi Eliezer says that after a year, husband is vested with sole revocatory power. However, aval truma, afilu midrabana namila acha. Maybe Rabbi Eliezer would disagree with the Mishnah Rishona, and would say that even after a year, halacha l'maisa, she can't eat truma. Say Rabbi say what the Gemara effectively does over here is that halacha l'maisa, there's not necessarily an alignment between the opinions between the Mishnah Rishon and Rabbi Eliezer. So we'll say, here's what we have. Let's just go back for just a second. What we have, number one, is we passing like this Mishnah Rishon, Mishnah Shnia, which is that halacha l'maisa after a year, if husband does not marry the wife, that triggers the support clause. He's obligated to provide her with mazonos. What is she not allowed to have? Truma. There's no truma until she enters into the chuppah. Furthermore, again, I will say, how do we pass when it comes to Nedarim? What happens if after a year he doesn't marry her? I will say the Rambam Pasch is like the Chachamim, namely, the only time husband has sole revocatory power is when? After Nisuin. And therefore, even after a year, even though the support obligation has been triggered, husband is not vested with sole revocatory power, ultimately until after Nisuin. I will say, Shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great day, everyone. A good Shabbos.